Welcome to the Solid Signal podcast for the week of January 16th, 2023. If you are a longtime listener to this podcast, you know I try to shake it up. I try to have some product stuff, some stuff that promotes the company that I work for, which is solidsignal.com. And sometimes I just like to go off topic on stuff that is perhaps of interest to the people who listen to this podcast. I think that nobody wants to listen to a sales pitch 100% of the time. That's not why you tune into a podcast. And I am very, very grateful that you have tuned into the podcast. And I want to make sure that it's entertaining for you in addition to being informative. This is a little bit more, I hope, of the entertaining part of the spectrum, as it were. And I want to talk right now about movies and TV shows based on video games. You know, for a long time, it was very hard to imagine a movie, at least a good movie or TV show based on a video game. It's true that, you know, there was a video game based on, I think it was Super Mario Brothers, about 25 years ago. And by the way, it was horrendous. But then, of course, video games have changed an awful lot in the last 25 years, and they've become a lot more plot driven. Even back in the 90s, I remember playing a game called Wing Commander 3, which was one of the very first movies, kind of TV, kind of video game crossovers. There was a movie version of Wing Commander, and it had started out as a video game. And Wing Commander 3 had video cutscenes to it. Given what the technology could support at the time, they are not very good, I'm sure. But it had video cutscenes, and you got to know a little bit more about the people, not just about the gameplay itself. Well, I think that there's been a lot of evolution since. I say I think because I'm not a huge gamer anymore here in the 2020s. Maybe I was in my youth, but I've got a lot of other things in my life. So I'm only peripherally aware of what's going on with video games. I will say that whenever I look at one of today's video games, I am quite frankly amazed by what they're capable of graphically and how it's evolved into an entire art form that is not something that I had really ever been a part of. And so this brings up the question of, can you make a good adaptation of a video game as a TV show or movie? As I said, there was definitely a time that you couldn't. And now, last night, HBO premiered The Last of Us, and I tend to bag on HBO a lot these days. It's not just because AT&T spun off DirecTV, and so I don't feel the same loyalty to them that I did, and how HBO, which was also an AT&T property, was sold off to Discovery, and so again, there's no loyalty, there's no connection. But I think that I'm not the only person who feels like HBO has seriously stumbled in the last 6 months, and it's just not the same thing that it once was. And we can go into a lot of detail about that, and I recommend that you read the Solid Signal blog, search for HBO, and you'll find a lot of articles about it, because that's not the subject of this week's podcast. The subject of this week's podcast, like I said, is video games and movies. But HBO premiered The Last of Us last night, and I think that even if you didn't know that the video game existed, you still would have found that it was a pretty compelling piece of television. Maybe not the best thing I've ever seen in the world, but certainly far from the worst. And I think that the fact that it really, the first episode is very much an adaptation of the very beginning part of that video game, from what I've been told, it says a lot about the ability to adapt video games into movies and TV and have that actually work. Because there's a lot more character development in video games these days, and because it's possible to have a video game that truly gets people invested in the characters and not in just the gameplay. There are going to be people who say you can't make a good movie from a video game, and I get that. But there were also people who said that you couldn't make a good movie from a comic book. And okay, so most of these people are long since gone, because I think we've been making good movies from comic books since about 1978 when they made Superman the movie. But certainly in the last 10 years, we've seen this evolution where comics and the properties and movies that they inspire have become the mythos of our times. We are all very aware of things like, the Avengers or Superman or Batman. It's part of who we are. It's part of the way that we communicate as a culture. And so we all agree now there's a path where comic books can become good movies and good TV. And I also remind you that many, many years in the past, more than 50, 60 years in the past, it was honestly believed that you could not make a good science fiction film. Science fiction was largely looked at as a child's medium. Yeah, there were some notable exceptions. You go back to the 1920s, a film like Metropolis, but for the most part, science fiction was looked at as a children's story. Most science fiction was intended for teenagers and preteens to kind of speculate what was going on, and it was never thought of as being this incredibly serious medium as it is now. And today, almost everything has a little bit of science fiction to it, because almost everything has a little bit of CGI, almost everything has a little bit of a bent of not quite being reality, and that makes it science fiction-y. I guess what I'm trying to say with all of this, and you have to kind of look at it as a big picture, is that good art can come from a lot of different places. We should never really look down upon a particular thing as being impossible for it to be artistic. No matter what it is that we look at today and we think, oh, there's no way that's art. Somebody could turn it into art in the future. And I think it's very possible. And I think that no matter what it is, that somebody will. Now, there's going to be a lot of bad stuff too. I mean, look, there have been a lot of bad comic book movies and quite a few bad video game movies and TV shows. And yet, it's getting better all the time. We saw this transition over and over again where something that was not thought of as an art form became an art form. I'm even willing to bet, in the absence of evidence, but I'm willing to bet that at one point that photography was not seen as a potential art form, that it was just a record of what was going on. And because somebody didn't lay down paint on canvas, that it wasn't really a true expression of art. We know that music, rock and roll was once thought of as a children's medium, really not worthy of serious consideration. And certainly in the last 50, 60 years, that has changed quite a bit. And I think all popular music was once thought of as something that to be looked down upon, where the only proper art form was classical music or whatever. Times change, things change, styles change, interest rates fluctuate, as it were. And our idea of what you can make art of changes. And so we always should be open to the future of looking around and seeing where art can come from. Art can come from a lot of different places. And no matter what it is, no matter what's in front of you, somebody could turn it into art in a totally unexpected way. I'm very aware that the audience for this podcast is a little bit older than the audience for most things. Now, if you happen to be between the ages of 18 and 34 and you're listening to this podcast, well, thank you. And I really appreciate that. I'm glad that there's something in what I say has got some resonance to you. If it does, great, and thank you again. But I'm also aware that the majority of the people who listen to this podcast and who also read the Solid Signal blog, then, they tend to be a little bit older, 40 to 65 or up. And there's a lot to be said about serving those demographics and not being, slavishly devoted to the young people either. But if you are in a little bit older demographic like I am, then you probably have spent some time over your life looking at things and realizing that stuff just has to change. Handwriting in cursive changes into typewriters, typewriters change into computers, computers change into phones, and the world goes on, and you either go on with it or you don't. But I hope that you go on with it, and I hope that whatever it is in your phase of life, wherever you are, that you continue to evolve and keep your eyes open to the new things in your life. They're not always going to be good, but just remember that they're not always going to be bad either. Just because something is there now and it wasn't there when you were a kid doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. Just because you don't understand what the young folks are doing doesn't mean that they're doing something wrong. It might mean they're doing something wrong, but you have to look at that and decide for yourself. That's the moral of the story for this week, I guess, which is always keep your eyes open, always keep learning, always keep looking at things in a new way. And you might just find that a video game could make a good TV show, even though you never thought it could. That's about it for the Solid Signal podcast for this week. As I always say, like, subscribe, and comment makes me look good to my bosses. Tune in every week for a new episode of the Solid Signal podcast. If you want to put something in the comments, here's something that I'd be kind of curious to hear what your point of view is. A lot of YouTube podcasts actually show people recording the podcast. They have an image on camera and you see the person doing it. I spend a lot of time looking around and making funny faces when I'm podcasting. I'm not sure if it's something that you really want to see. But if you do think that you'd like to see my image while I'm recording this podcast instead of just hear my voice, leave a comment and let's talk more about it. As always, shop at solidsignal.com. Your home for everything that you need to live your best digital life. Solidsignal.com, the place where they actually answer the phone when you have a question. Call 888-233-7563 if you don't believe me. Shop solidsignal.com, and I will talk to you again next week.